The photograph should not have stopped me. I have restored hundreds like it. Sepia portraits softened by age. Faces fixed into the stiff patience of the 19th century. Hands folded as if instructed by the photographer to remain still for eternity. This one arrived from a private Midwestern archive with no special note attached. Two Sisters, 1890, River Falls, Ohio. Family collection. Routine work. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. The sisters stood close together, shoulders nearly touching, their dresses identical but for small details at the collar. Their expressions were solemn in the way young women were taught to be solemn then. Eyes steady, mouths restrained, no hint of intimacy that might invite speculation. I began the restoration the way I always do. Cleaning chemical damage, correcting contrast, reconstructing the emulsion fractures along the edges. I sharpened the faces, then the fabric, then the background. Only after that did I enlarge the hands. I almost missed it. The gesture is subtle if you are not looking for meaning. Fingers touching, overlapping in a way that could be mistaken for nervous habit. But as I isolated the area and increased the resolution, the configuration resolved into something precise. Deliberate. Not a pose, a sign. I stared at the screen longer than was professional. The fingers were arranged too carefully to be accidental. Each joint held at an exact angle. The symmetry between the sisters was perfect, mirrored as if rehearsed. This was not affection. This was not coincidence. This was communication. My first reaction was disbelief. People in 1890 did not encode messages into family portraits. Not women. Not sisters standing under a photographer's eye, knowing the image would be displayed, passed down, scrutinized. Unless they were trying to leave something behind. I checked the archive notes again. The Walker family. Respectable. No criminal record. No scandal attached. The town itself barely appeared in historical indexes, except for industrial growth and temperance disputes. And yet, here were two women risking everything to leave evidence in plain sight. Because that is what this was. I knew it immediately, in the same instinctive way you recognize handwriting or a familiar face. Someone wanted this sign to survive. Someone wanted it to be seen by a future that could understand it, even if their own world could not. The question pressed in before I could stop it. What could two sisters have known? What could they have been involved in that made a photograph safer than silence? And more disturbing still, what happened to them that made this their only remaining voice? I saved the file under a new name, backed it up twice, and shut down my workstation. That night, I did not sleep. The image kept returning. Not their faces, but their hands, frozen mid-declaration, waiting for someone like me to notice. Waiting far longer than they should have had to. River Falls is not on most maps people keep in their heads. It sits in western Ohio, where the rail lines once promised progress and the river promised work. And by 1890, it had learned to present itself as respectable. The town advertised tidy brick storefronts, church picnics, and a bandstand on summer evenings. It even had a courthouse with white columns meant to look older than it was. But the courthouse was theater. The law here was not an authority. It was a service purchased in installments. Real power lived in the distilleries along the water and the saloons that clustered around the rail yard like barnacles. The men who owned them spoke softly in public and loudly in private. And they did not need to threaten often because the town had watched what happened the last time someone forced them to. They financed the sheriff's campaigns. They kept the judge's brother employed. They loaned money to councilmen whose farms had failed and collected that debt with smiles. They paid for school books and hymnals and then reminded everyone, when convenient, that generosity could be withdrawn. Temperance existed here the way disease does, spoken about in whispers, blamed on the weak, treated as a nuisance until it became unavoidable. Women organized sewing circles that were not only sewing circles. Pastors preached restraint while accepting donations that smelled of grain mash and smoke. A man could stagger out of O'Rourke's saloon at noon and be seen in the front pew by Sunday, and no one would call it hypocrisy, because hypocrisy was the town's lubricant. It kept the machinery running without friction. It allowed people to live beside their own disgust. I learned that early in my research, after the photograph had already started to feel like an accusation. I began tracing River Falls through newspapers and county ledgers, and the pattern repeated with a consistency that was almost comforting, until you recognized what it meant. Complaints were recorded and then quietly amended. Names disappeared from minutes. Licenses were granted despite objections that never made it into print. When violence broke out near the rail yard, the reports were strangely vague, as if the paper itself were afraid to be specific. In towns like this, a person does not vanish in a dramatic way. There are no screams that bring neighbors running, no public dragging into the street. The system does not need spectacle. It needs compliance, and compliance is easier when fear is routine. So River Falls practiced a different kind of disappearance. A woman speaks too loudly about her husband's wages being paid in drink. Suddenly, her landlord needs the room back. A shopkeeper refuses to extend credit to a saloon that never pays on time. His supplier forgets his order for 3 weeks. A preacher's son starts asking questions about missing church funds and finds himself arrested for disorderly conduct, the charge made to stick just long enough to ruin his prospects. Nothing illegal on paper. Nothing a judge could not explain away with a shrug. And then there were the older stories, the ones that did not fit cleanly into any record. Men who went out to check traps by the river and were lost for days, returning with their eyes wrong, refusing to say where they had been. Women who packed to leave town and never arrived at the next station, their trunks found later with the locks broken and the contents scattered, as if someone had been searching for a single letter. A fire at a print shop that somehow burned only the back room where invoices were kept. A ledger in the sheriff's office that showed a gap of months, as if time itself had been torn out. What made River Falls dangerous was not that it was lawless. It was that it had law, and the law belonged to the same hands that poured the whiskey. The Walker name sat neatly inside this arrangement. A workshop owner with skilled labor, respectable contracts, and enough influence to be invited to the right dinners. The kind of family that could pretend neutrality while the town's factions ground against one another. That respectability was a shield, until it became a leash. Because once the liquor men decided you were useful, you were no longer independent. You were integrated. Reading the town's paper trail, I kept returning to a rule that never appeared in any ordinance, never in any printed proclamation, but was enforced with the same certainty as gravity. If you threatened the order, the town would remove you, and then it would behave as if you had never existed. I thought at first that this was simply my modern cynicism imposed on a distant place. Then I looked again at Ellen and Mabel's hands. Their gesture did not look like hope. It looked like calculation. It looked like two people who understood that speech could be intercepted, letters could be opened, meetings could be infiltrated. Yet a photograph, once made, could travel quietly through time. If they chose that method, it meant they believed the ordinary channels were already owned. And that meant the danger was not a single man, or even a single crime. It was the entire town, trained to forget on command. I did not know the Walker sisters yet, when I first encountered their names in the records. At that stage they were only ink, birth dates, church confirmations, a mention of apprenticeship work in their father's shop. Respectable daughters of a respectable man. The kind of women history rarely bothers to describe in detail because their existence is assumed to be uncomplicated. It wasn't. Ellen and Mabel Walker were close in age, close enough that townspeople often spoke of them as a pair rather than as individuals. Ellen was the elder by 3 years, quieter, careful with her words, already practiced in the art of being overlooked. Mabel was sharper, quicker to speak, possessed of a restlessness that made her ill-suited to River Falls' expectations of female patience. Together, they occupied a narrow space of safety created by their father's standing and their own careful behavior. Publicly, their lives followed the approved pattern. Church on Sundays, volunteer work arranged through the ladies' temperance auxiliaries that were allowed to exist so long as they did not threaten revenue. Sewing, bookkeeping, polite conversation with customers who came to the workshop for repairs or commissions. Nothing that would alarm the men who paid attention to such things. Privately, the sisters were already committed. I found the first hint of it in a ledger that had nothing to do with politics. It was an inventory list for donated pamphlets, kept by a church-affiliated reading room. Most titles were harmless: religious tracts, household guides, sentimental fiction. But every few months, a different kind of text appeared briefly before vanishing from the next update. Reports on alcohol-related violence, statistical summaries of wages lost to drink, essays written by women in other states describing municipal corruption tied to liquor interests. Someone had been circulating material and then removing it before questions could be asked. Later, in correspondence from a regional temperance organizer, I found a line that stopped me cold. The sisters in River Falls remain committed, though conditions are worsening. No names, no details, just that. Ellen and Mabel were not agitators in the open sense. They did not march. They did not preach. They did not confront saloon owners or demand reform at council meetings. They did something far more dangerous. They listened. They collected small truths that men assumed women would forget. Dates, names, payment schedules, which councilman drank for free and which one paid in promises, which deputy looked the other way, and which one quietly escorted certain drunks home to avoid scandal. They compared notes. They wrote nothing down in one place. They trusted only a handful of other women who had learned, through loss, that silence was not the same as safety. Their father knew none of this at first, or so the record suggests. He was a practical man, invested in survival more than ideals. His workshop depended on contracts that came, indirectly, from the same economic engine his daughters were beginning to map. To him, River Falls was flawed but manageable. A place where you learned whom not to offend and carried on. That illusion ended when Mabel made her first mistake. It was not a grand error. It was the kind born of exhaustion and moral urgency. She confided too much to someone she believed shared her anger. A woman whose husband drank away half his wages and blamed everyone but himself. That woman repeated what she had heard, not maliciously, but carelessly, to a cousin who worked nights at a distillery office. Information does not travel quickly in River Falls. It travels efficiently. Within days, questions began appearing in places they did not belong. A supplier asked the Walker father whether his daughters had taken an interest in things best left to men. A customer joked, too lightly, about temperance women counting coins they'd never be allowed to spend. The laughter that followed was a warning disguised as humor. That was when their father understood that something had shifted. He confronted Mabel first, not with anger, but with fear. He had seen what happened to men who crossed the distilleries. He knew how quickly a good name could become an obstacle rather than a shield. Ellen was present for that conversation, silent, watching both of them calculate. The choice placed before him was not dramatic. It rarely is. He could protect his daughters by ending what they had started, or he could protect the family by ensuring the men in power saw him as cooperative. He chose cooperation. He told himself it was temporary, that compliance would buy time, that River Falls would eventually correct itself, or that his daughters would marry and leave. He told himself that a father's duty was to preserve what already existed, not gamble it on confrontation. The problem was that once he made that decision, the town understood him perfectly, and so did his daughters. The photograph would come later. The sign would come later. But the moral collapse began here, in a workshop filled with tools and good intentions, where a man decided that survival required alignment, and two women learned that their own blood might become part of the system that would erase them. The people who leave the least trace are often the ones who see the most. I did not understand that until I began noticing how often the same marginal names appeared at the edges of the Walker story. Not principals, not decision-makers. Servants, tradesmen, assistants, people whose livelihoods depended on invisibility. They were never centered in any account, but they were everywhere, like pressure points beneath the surface. There was the domestic servant who worked in the Walker home only 2 days a week, hired help considered too unimportant to merit scrutiny. Her name surfaced once in a payroll ledger, and nowhere else. Yet she was present on evenings when unfamiliar men arrived at the house after dark. She cleared glasses from the parlor and learned, without trying, who drank and who did not. She noticed when voices dropped, when the tone shifted from business to threat. She could not repeat what she heard, but she remembered it. There was the typesetter at the local print shop, a man trusted to set announcements and invoices, but not opinions. He handled notices that never ran, articles that were edited down until they said nothing at all. He learned which names could be printed and which ones caused a quiet visit from the sheriff before dawn. When a piece came across his table that mentioned temperance in connection with wages, he set it carefully, and then made a second copy for himself before the forms were broken. And there was the photography assistant. He is the one who haunts me most. Photography in 1890 was not instantaneous. It required preparation, patience, repetition. Assistants arranged backdrops, adjusted light, instructed subjects where to stand and how to hold themselves. They watched faces tighten when someone was nervous, saw hands fidget when words could not be spoken. This assistant worked regularly with the same families. He knew who smiled naturally and who had learned to hold still. When Ellen and Mabel Walker arrived for their portrait, he noticed that they asked unusual questions. How long exposure would take, whether small movements mattered, whether hands needed to remain visible. Someone suggested the photograph. I cannot prove who, but the evidence implies it was not the sisters alone. The idea of embedding a sign, of using the permanence of an image as a container for meaning, required someone who understood both the risks and the process. Someone who could ensure the framing did not crop the gesture. Someone who would not correct the pose. The assistant did not speak. He simply allowed it. Around the same time, letters began to move differently through River Falls. A domestic servant hid envelopes inside folded linens sent out for laundering. A typesetter slipped notes between layers of paper that would be bound together and shipped out of town. Dates were memorized, not written. Names were reduced to initials, then to references only insiders could decode. This was not resistance in the heroic sense. It was quiet preservation. They all understood the same rule Ellen and Mabel did. Evidence without power is dangerous. Evidence with no safe outlet is fatal. The only option was delay, stretching truth forward into a future that might be able to receive it. I found one account years later, buried in a memoir that was never published. The author described a sense among certain women that something was being prepared, like a sealed letter none of us would live to open. That sentence had been crossed out, then written back in darker ink. The Walker sisters were no longer acting alone by then. They had become nodes in a fragile network of people who could not confront authority, but could refuse to let it fully close its fist. Each person carried only a fragment. No one held the whole. That is why the photograph matters so much. A letter can be burned. A ledger can be altered. A witness can be discredited. But a family portrait, displayed on a mantle or stored in a trunk, passes inspection precisely because it appears harmless. It is not read the way documents are read. It is looked at. And looking is less regulated than reading. The sign in Ellen and Mabel's hands was not just a declaration. It was a redundancy. A backup system built by people who assumed that everything else would fail. Which means they were already preparing for loss. By the time rumors began circulating more openly, by the time River Falls developed that peculiar anticipatory quiet that precedes a decision, the people without voices had already done what they could. They had hidden copies, memorized sequences, positioned evidence where it might outlive them. None of it could stop what came next, but it could ensure that the town would never fully succeed in forgetting. And that, in a place like River Falls, was the most dangerous act available to people who officially did not matter at all. Rumors in River Falls did not arrive all at once. They accumulated, thin as dust, until everyone was breathing them without noticing. I could see the shift in the paper trail before it appeared in any testimony. Notices that had once been politely worded grew clipped. Meetings were announced with less advance warning. The temperance auxiliaries were no longer mentioned by name, only referred to as certain gatherings. Even the weather reports shrank, as if the town were conserving ink for something more important. Someone had spoken when they were not supposed to. The first explicit reference to Mabel appears in a sheriff's memorandum I almost missed because it was misfiled. It described an unverified sighting of her near the river on an evening when she was expected to be elsewhere. The language was careful, legalistic. No accusation, no charge. Just a suggestion placed gently into the record, like bait. Whispers followed. That she had been meeting someone. That she had documents. That she had become careless. None of it was confirmed, and none of it needed to be. In River Falls, implication did the work of evidence. Ellen's diary from that period, what survives of it, changes tone abruptly. Dates are still recorded, but details thin out. Where she once described conversations obliquely, she now writes about waiting, about listening for footsteps, about the sound of the river at night and how it carried voices farther than it should. She does not name her fear, but it is everywhere. Every option available to the family was ruinous. If they spoke openly, the workshop would be destroyed within weeks. Contracts revoked, credit withdrawn. Their father would be labeled unstable, untrustworthy. Ellen and Mabel would be dismissed as hysterical or immoral, depending on what was most useful at the moment. If they remained silent, the town would act on its own timetable. The decision was not recorded anywhere official. It did not need to be. The solution River Falls preferred was simple and had been used before. Problems did not have to be disproven. They only had to be removed. Mabel disappeared on a Thursday. The notice appeared 2 days later, printed small, tucked between advertisements. Miss M. Walker has departed River Falls to pursue opportunities elsewhere. No destination listed. No farewell gathering announced. Just absence, framed as choice. I checked train records. No ticket under her name. No corresponding luggage entry. Ellen's later notes make it clear she knew the announcement was a lie the moment she saw it. She describes standing in the workshop, holding the paper, realizing that the town had already decided what version of events it would accept. 2 days after Mabel vanished, the man rumored to have been her informant was found dead. The report is infuriating in its blandness. No signs of violence, no witnesses. Sudden collapse. The investigation closed within 72 hours. Cause of death undetermined, therefore unremarkable. The town moved on with visible relief. I kept waiting for outrage in the record, for questions, for someone to demand connection between the disappearance and the death. There was nothing. Instead, the Walker father sold his workshop at a loss so severe it bordered on punishment. The buyer was connected, indirectly, plausibly, to the distillery interests. Within a month, the family name vanished from business directories. Within 2, they left the state. Except for Ellen. She remained, though not in the way she had existed before. Her name appears occasionally after that, attached to innocuous activities. Church attendance, temporary lodging, no profession listed. She had become something the town could tolerate. Quiet, diminished, watchful. The system recorded its outcome efficiently. 1 woman gone, 1 man dead, a family neutralized. No scandal, no trial, no acknowledgement that anything had ever been wrong. But the photograph already existed. It had been taken before the rumors hardened, before the decision finalized. It had been developed, printed, distributed as a harmless artifact of respectability. Which means Ellen lived the rest of her life knowing that the truth had survived her sister, even if she could not yet release it. That knowledge is what the town never accounted for. They erased Mabel. They silenced witnesses. They closed the case. What they could not undo was the fact that, once made, some evidence does not need permission to endure. Mabel's disappearance did not end the story. It finalized it. That distinction matters because what followed was not chaos, but consolidation. River Falls did what systems always do after an interruption. It closed ranks, documented its own innocence, and redistributed risk downward until no single hand appeared responsible. The man who died, the would-be informant, was reduced to a footnote. His death certificate listed a cause vague enough to discourage curiosity. His employer paid for a modest burial. No family member contested the finding, and if they suspected more, the record shows they kept it to themselves. Silence, once again, functioned as currency. The Walker father sold the workshop within weeks. The price was insulting, but he accepted it without negotiation. That detail stays with me. A man who had once argued over pennies suddenly relinquishing decades of labor as if it were already gone. The transaction reads like surrender, but I think it was penance. He had aligned himself with the men who took his daughter, and River Falls collected payment anyway. He left Ohio shortly after. The trail ends abruptly, suggesting deliberate erasure rather than accident. No new business filings, No census listings under his name that match age and profession. It is as if he stepped sideways out of the record. That kind of disappearance requires cooperation from more than one office. Ellen stayed. Her decision to remain is the hardest for me to understand, and the easiest to misread. At first glance, it looks like defeat. A woman stripped of family, ambition, and protection, lingering in the place that destroyed her sister. But the longer I sat with her surviving words, the more that interpretation failed. She became smaller on paper, yes, but sharper. Her later diary entries are sparse to the point of austerity. She records weather, errands, minor observations. But occasionally, a sentence slips through that reveals intention. I am still here. They do not know what I know. Time is a kind of shelter. Ellen lived long enough to bury both parents. She lived long enough to see the distillery interests fracture, reorganize, rename themselves. She lived long enough to watch men who had once been untouchable die unremarkably, their influence dissolving into heirs who did not remember why certain rules existed. She did not speak publicly. She did not confront anyone. She did not attempt to resurrect Mabel's name in a town that had trained itself not to hear it. Instead, she prepared. The diaries that resurfaced decades later were not confessional. They were inventories. Lists of who attended which meetings. Notes on which officials changed positions after elections. Observations about which businesses failed when credit tightened and which survived. It was not the writing of a woman seeking justice. It was the work of someone preserving context. The photograph remained in her possession until her death. I know this because of the way it was stored. Not displayed, not hidden. Wrapped carefully, but not obsessively, with other family items that would survive estate dispersal. She positioned it to be passed on, not protected forever. That choice suggests trust, not in people, but in time. The system had won in its own terms. Mabel was gone. The case was closed. River Falls moved forward unburdened. But Ellen understood something the system did not. Victory that depends on forgetting is temporary. It requires constant maintenance. It assumes the past will stay quiet. She outlived the men who decided her sister was a problem to be solved. She outlived the configuration of power that made their decision possible. And she left behind a record that could not accuse anyone directly, but refused to let the pattern disappear. By the time I encountered the photograph, the town had already told itself the story it preferred for more than a century. What Ellen left behind was not a refutation. It was a delay. Long enough for someone like me to finally see what had been placed, patiently, in plain sight. The answer to the photograph came quietly. There was no dramatic revelation, no cipher broken in a single moment. The hand sign revealed itself the way truth often does, through accumulation. I saw it again in another archive, then again in a pamphlet margin, then once more in a diary sketch made by a woman who never named what she was recording. The gesture was part of a short-lived system used by women who could not afford written language that might betray them. It signified alignment, warning, and readiness. A declaration made only when silence had become more dangerous than exposure. Ellen and Mabel were not hiding affection. They were stating intent. Once I understood that, the photograph stopped being a mystery and became something worse. Evidence that was never meant to save them. It was meant to outlast them. The official version of events still exists. You can find it if you look. Mabel Walker left town. River Falls prospered. No crimes were committed that could be proven. The town's story is internally consistent, polished by repetition and age. But the other record exists too. It lives in Ellen's restraint, in the servant's memory, in the typesetter's copy, in a photograph that behaved exactly as it was designed to, passing quietly through hands that did not know what they were carrying, until one day, someone did. That is the part that unsettles me the most. Nothing about this survived by accident. Every element required cooperation from people who understood they would never benefit from being right. People who assumed they would be erased and acted anyway. They did not imagine justice as revelation or punishment. They imagined it as persistence. I sometimes wonder whether Ellen believed anyone would ever decode the sign, or whether she simply needed to know that Mabel's resistance had not vanished with her body, that something of her remained ungoverned. If the truth surfaced once, it can surface again. Which raises the question I cannot put down. How many other photographs are waiting? How many gestures dismissed as coincidence? How many archives contain objects that were never meant to speak until the system that silenced them was safely dead? River Falls forgot because it was trained to. History, as it turns out, is less obedient. The photograph has been restored now. Cleaned, stabilized, cataloged. It will sit in a controlled environment, available to anyone who looks closely enough. That is all Ellen ever asked of the future. Not belief, not justice. Witness.